Hello and welcome to Tea Time. I am T and the reading room is now open. I'm going to make short work of the war question. They happen a lot more than I'm comfortable with. They cost lives, property, public goodwill, relations, possibly the future. And the bottom line is it's a habit that people always have. I'm hoping they won't always be this way, but whether it's personals, individuals feuding, homicide, violence in general is just somehow it's an irrational response to external stimuli, and it's part of our animal brain or whatever it is. People do it individually and collectively, and it's been in a lot of ways sacred and romanticized by cultures. Of course, their own, for the instant culture, their own soldiers would be romanticized, and then the other soldiers on the other side would be demonized. But since World War II anyway, there has been this United Nations, which at Article 2 in its charter says that the organization is based on principle of sovereign equality, and that states are obliged to settle their disputes verbally, basically, and that states must refrain from threat or use of force against other states, and this includes observers like Palestine. Now, unfortunately, even the smartest of people falls into this trap where they have to choose one side or another, and they end up running around in circles making excuses for and justifying the loss of life and, blowing people up, slaughtering people. And they'll say, but X did Y, so then then Z gets to do whatever to X. But at the same time, it is true that an eye for an eye only leaves the world blind, and the current war is only the most recent event in a long history of the exact same thing, where who's to say exactly who started? Who's to blame, as the B-52 sang. This party really got out of hand. Now, the United Nations I want to say it's Article 42, can, through the Security Council, authorize the use of force, but it has done so only rarely. You can see here 1950, 1990 against Iraq. It did not authorize use of force in 2002 to invade Iraq. Did the UN Security Council approve the invasion of Afghanistan? I think they might have. Approved the war effort from the outset. Now, just because a bunch of people get together and agree on something doesn't make it right exactly. Am I a fan of terrorism? No, that goes along with the idea that we have a Venn diagram, superset and subset. And if B is violence, then A is inside of B. Any kind of specific violence is still violence, and I'm not for violence. And of course, there's all this fancy, basically crooked sort of reasoning that, at least in recent years, has been largely a capitalist or a capital endeavor, because wars are profitable for a few, for those companies that sell the arms. As Country Joe and the Fish sang, and they're fixin' like I'm about to die rag. There's plenty of good money to be made supplying the army with the tools of the trade. And to some degree, it's always been that way. yet to another extent, it's not proportional anymore. So in the question of Afghanistan, well, Osama bin Laden was a stateless person who was found in Pakistan, so how they ended up in Afghanistan is yet another question. Though at very least, when there's some sort of international consensus or written statement on it, then it doesn't look so bad. But the result is still the same, whether illegal or legal. So now here, the ICRC, the International Committee of the Red Cross, says it quite clearly, war is forbidden. And that's what it is. Now, people do stuff that's forbidden. And then if we go to Quora, this is basically democracy here. Or, the majority, the loudest number will say what they want, and then it seems like people make it their life's work to be loud and join up with the cool thing to do. Now there are laws of, this Wikipedia, I'm not a huge fan, but it does have some decent information. The laws of war, use ad bellum before of the war, and the laws in war. If you ask me, war is the absence of law, and so it is a little bit silly to say this or that, but that's pretty much the whole story with that topic, and you can refer to any number of different articles for more information. But it's basically that a really simple argument has been made out to look like it's really complicated, but it's not. In this article here, I run through the debacle that is international law, especially with regard to war. It's a lot of words, and I think maybe that's the reason why people don't really dig into this stuff. But then they'll go to church on Sunday, and although Catholicism is 17th century or something, let's have a quick look, just because self-defense is always the defense for any type of armed insurrection, which appears on its face to be a violation of the UN Charter and territorial sovereignty, and I'll get into the rest of it in just a moment. Let's look at the Catholic Church and collective self-defense. I know it's in the Catechism in here somewhere. Self-defense is a right, obviously, but somewhere in here I know that it mentions that, for example, giving chase to somebody, organizing a war, basically. Here's the Catechism. Organizing a war, as per the fifth commandment, thou shalt not kill, which means murder. Organizing a militia or an army to run around the world and blow people up more or less indiscriminately in purported pursuit of some sort of wrongdoers is not in the spirit of self-defense. It is offense. And if somebody comes into another person's home and there's immediate, imminent, and unavoidable danger, then that's a different story, obviously. But love toward oneself remains a fundamental principle of morality. Obviously, laying down and dying is not the only other option. It's a false dichotomy. But it's the idea of necessary violence, and that's kind of where this movie here, Official Secrets, got into proportionality. And, this is a really messy subject. It's very uncomfortable for everybody to talk about. But if a life for a life, or 5,000 lives for 5,000 lives, I don't know. What is proportional? It's going to be a little bit more than just simple ratios, but I think there is a common sense angle here, where what is necessary violence, and again, this is kind of the problem with the legal system being ill-equipped to handle claims against itself, because since time immemorial, the lords and masters of the castle have been able to force others, coerce others, and otherwise compel others to go out and do their bidding. And so I'm in agreement with what we see here. Capital punishment even is banned under the Catholic thesis, because if a person is removed from society, then it costs more to appeal their cases in the United States than it would just to let them linger in prison for the rest of their life. And if you ask me, a life of imprisonment is probably just as or worse, just as bad or worse than the threat of being euthanized. But these are all very grim topics. However, these things happen, and perhaps because they're very unhappy topics, then people avoid them. But let's just think simply. Think like a child would if it weren't such a nervous, scared sort of topic. Like, is it legal to occupy a foreign country? And I think we're going to get a big no. Occupation, these are what? It's nice that the occupying powers have certain obligations, although who's there to police them? Belligerent occupation. Oh, so here's the situation with people who are fighting against the occupiers, regardless of the occupiers' reasoning. And the inhabitants are under no obligation to abide by the rule of the belligerents, and we all can read. There it is right there. There it is right there. The civilian population in occupied territory owe no allegiance. Now, one can imagine what would happen if, there's a lot of overdose deaths, and there's a lot of what we would call extrajudicial killings in the United States, and there's a lot of homicide. And one can only imagine, and the system of democracy is fairly dysfunctional. One can only imagine if some foreign country, came to the purported rescue. I think Putin drummed up the weapons of mass destruction excuse for invading Ukraine. Excuse me, and it's nearly comical, because there's no legitimate reason to invade a country and destroy people, lives, property, civility. There just is no legitimate reason. This isn't the days of old when, or maybe it is. I guess maybe that's part of the problem, is that a lot of people just see a through line between the far ancient past, the present, and then the future, which they plan to continue the same behaviors of the far ancient past. But the civilian population is the majority of the people. This is the majority of the casualties, and they're going to take up arms. Just like if some other country came and tried to liberate the United States, people would take up arms. And so the people of Iraq and Afghanistan and wherever else take up arms, and then it just turns into a huge fight. Now, whether people choose to understand it that way or not is a different story, but these are the illusions, the lies that people tell themselves in order to believe in their country, in order to believe in their flag, in order to believe that their husband or brother or father who went off to war and was able to basically commit murder just because it was in a different territory, then come home. These are the stories people tell themselves to make that okay. But whether Russians in Ukraine or Soviets in Afghanistan or wherever the case may be, the occupying force has no legitimate legal jurisdiction, no right to compel any behavior from anybody. They are there illegally. And it just devolves into an animal situation where the person with the biggest guns and the most fortitude, the most troops, or the least conscience will prevail, And so this is a prime reason why after World War II, the nations got together and decided on these principles. And in writing this, they could not have meant that there would be so many exceptions and that there would be these excluded cases. They could not have meant that one country would have bases and troops deployed all over the world using diplomatic, or the quoted quote-unquote diplomatic and economic sanctions as leverage to basically get what they want. They could not have intended for nuclear proliferation. The same countries who signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty end up having more nuclear weapons throughout the period of that treaty than would be expected. The authors and framers of this convention could not have intended for significant derogation from its principles. They could not have, they might have been able to predict that, this is just a nice idea, but they could not have written it with the intent that there would be a handful of strong-arm countries, some of which are a disaster at home, who then compel and coerce and otherwise force other countries to abide by the status quo, which is then developed and deployed by that handful of powerful countries. And I suppose that's where a lot of people would rather just see the dissolution of the United Nations and think that it's some sort of evil, but that there is some organization rather than just a bunch of independent actors who are pursuing their own selfish pursuits, who are just trying to take care of themselves by force, by fraud, by whatever means possible or necessary. That this at least gives us a little bit of hope, albeit possibly false hope. I mean, similarly, at home, countries have civil and human rights about anti-discrimination, about citizenship, about people have rights to not being interfered with, and whether civilian or state actor, there are violations of that code, and so law on paper does not exactly have effect in the real world. However, I find no reason, no rational, civilized reason to turn this on its head, to think the opposite of what the apparent meaning is. But that's indeed what some lawyers are paid to do, and that's indeed what government officials do, and that's what military officers do when they intend to deploy troops, when they intend to manipulate, coerce, and otherwise control or force or threaten with force people in foreign sovereign territories, when they would not accept being on the receiving end of that bargain. And so the whole idea of double standard, it needs to be expanded, that there are just so many different standards that sure, if we kind of like zoom out, it's the strong versus the weak, or the rich versus the poor, or those with technology versus those without. But that's kind of how we got into the colonial era too. The Brits took over Hong Kong because they had technology. The French took over Southeast Asia because they had technology, and parts of Africa because they had technology. That the United States poaches foreign talent, causing brain drain abroad, and then uses those scientific discoveries to make great weapons mass destruction, and has basically lucked out in being the world's reserve currency, does not imply that it is outside of the scope of the law. It's not outside the jurisdiction which it agreed to, and that despite it not being part of the Vienna Convention on the law of treaties, it is still duly bound to uphold some jus cogens, or norms and customs among civilized nations. But then, of course, that conversation devolves and degrades too, because what are the norms and customs among civilized nations? And that's kind of where I get to international legal disorder, where in the first, in the introduction here, I mentioned that, what's his face, the Secretary of State from the Vietnam era, Dr. Strangelove, wrote a book wherein he talked about how there's no apparent order in the international system. And so let's just look out what are use cogens, norms, and customs. Because these are obligatory regardless of whether countries or people agree. Customary international law, peremptory norm. What is the peremptory norm? Almost nothing, right? Well, that's only because people backslide and fail to abide by their, I mean, if moral conscience is a real thing, it is at the individual level, and so groups being just collections of individuals, moral conscience does exist. It's just that people tend to avoid serious discussion when maybe they're threatened by complying with a norm, you know, when it's not for their benefit, basically. Certain idealism, sure. Foundational structure. Again, we're just like talking in circles about soft law here. But what does it mean? It means non-use of force. But you know what? I think we all inherently know what it means to be civilized and to be honest. Shared skepticism towards use code, and that's kind of the international system, that just like individuals experience mistrust among other individuals, so do nations experience this an elevated sense, apparently. Superior norms of sanctioning. Let's get a list here. I mean, this is the hard research that isn't really fit for a few-minute talk. Listed. You know, you have to sit and really read over this type of stuff in order to truly understand what it is. And then if somebody reads over it in detail and at length, then they ought to come to the same type of conclusions that, well, what is the objective? What are we trying to do here as nations? And I suppose it's the same sort of story across the board. I've mentioned it with education and with economy. What are we really trying to do as a society? You know, what is the group connection? So bare minimums, crimes against humanity, genocide, slavery, human trafficking, those are bare minimums, you know? And then beyond that, you're going to get crimes against humanity. And so is Hamas a terrorist organization? Sure. You know, are they right? Nope. Is Israel probably overstepping? Kind of looks like it. And so we can't keep two thoughts in mind at the same time, that the Hatfields and the McCoys need to stop shooting at each other? Why? Because in this recent round, the McCoys shot first. And so what, then the Hatfields get to go, you know, do whatever they want for X amount of time? Well, who's going to blow the whistle? I think we're blowing the whistle. So that is tea time. The reading room is now closed.